Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Between the Lines. This is your co-host, Michael, and today I'm going to be talking about the Taiping Rebellion. And so I'm going to be structuring this episode similar to last time when I was talking about the Boxer Rebellion. I'm going to be talking about the causes, the history of the event, the Taiping society, aftermath, and then commentary. And for commentary, I'm going to kind of stick to opinions and maybe historiographic concerns, historiographic questions about the Taiping Rebellion. Now, so the Taiping Rebellion, what is it? Well, you can approach it two ways. You can think of the Taiping Rebellion as just that, as a rebellion. This is a group of people rebelling against an established power, against the established Qing dynasty. You can also look at it as a civil war, Chinese versus Chinese. This wasn't only all Manchurians versus all Chinese, because the Qing government employed Chinese generals and Chinese soldiers to fight the Taiping. So this isn't a civil war this isn't a kind of war where it's just all one race versus the other. It's a civil war in that Chinese, in fact, did fight other Chinese. And so there really isn't a point to get into nitty gritty details. I don't really think that's going to serve a huge purpose, and that's not the purpose of this general introduction. And so let's start with the causes of the Taiping Rebellion. So the Taiping Rebellion, the story of the Taiping Rebellion generally starts with Hong Xiuquan, who lived from 1814 to 1864. And so Hong was a Chinese from Hakka descent. And Hakka is just another Chinese kind of culture linguistic group. And so, like most Chinese, especially men, he wanted to become a scholar. He wanted to be part of the Confucian scholar gentry. And unfortunately for him, in 1827, he actually failed to attain the lowest degree in all of the imperial examination. His third time was in 1837, and after this, the poor guy had an emotional breakdown, and he had a vision that he was speaking to a venerable old man with a golden beard. And this man was telling him to rid the world of evil spirits. Hong had his fourth and last try in 1843. And his cousin Li Jingfan actually told him, he told Hong that, oh, hey, you have a book on your shelf, and why do you have this book? And the book's title was Good Words for Exhorting the Age. And it was through this book, this is a sort of a Christian influenced book, and it had some passages from the Bible. And actually Hong reread this book and said, oh, okay, so now my visions make sense. The visions I had earlier was actually me talking to God, in that he was the Son of God. So from that moment, from 1843, Hong believed that he was the Son of God. In 1847, Hong actually went to study Christianity with the American Reverend I.J. Roberts, but Hong's interpretation of Christianity was that the Christian God was a wrathful God. Now the revolt officially begins in July 1850, but Hong didn't declare the Taiping Tianguo, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, the name of his new sort of country. He didn't declare this until January the 1st, 1851. By that point, you could also argue that the rebellion officially began with the actual proclamation of that country. Now, a little bit more background: foreign influences in 1850 or up to 1850. Keep in mind that Britain had defeated China in the first Opium War from 1839 to 1842. And so the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 forced China to give up its merchant system, this Kohong system, and China was forced to open up more treaty ports, 4 more treaty ports, and then an indemnity, and then China had to also cede Hong Kong because of this war. And more Western powers were beginning to penetrate, noticing how China was weakened, noticing how China was not an invincible country, and noticing that the sort of gap in technological knowledge. Different foreign countries were starting to prey on China, not in full yet, but this was getting there. And so there was definitely going to be more influence from Western Western powers such as Britain or France, let's just say whether it be through business or through missionary activity, after that first Opium War in 1839, when it first started, there was definitely going to be more foreign influence. And so that kind of gives us a little bit of the introduction for the event. So it started with Hong Xiuquan, and also talk a little bit about the kind of like general diplomatic situation that China was in. So here's the history event, and we're not going to go year by year. That isn't really the point, but the point mainly is to try to get some kind of general summary. So the Taiping ended up capturing Nanjing in 1853, but Hong Xiuquan stops his army here in Nanjing and actually makes Nanjing his capital. I believe he calls it Tianjin, the heavenly capital. And he actually does send a northern expedition to Beijing, but this northern expedition fails. The Qing government is having trouble. The Qing are having trouble capitalizing on this failure, but slowly but surely, the Qing are gaining. The Qing are trying to do everything they can, and they're slowly adopting new ways like firearms and new tactics to try to beat the Taiping. Actually, within the Taiping itself, they were having problems. For example, the Taiping Minister of State, Yang Xiaoqing, planned to usurp the throne, so Hong actually killed him. And then there was another Taiping general, the general that Hong sent to kill Yang, he himself became haughty, and so Hong had to kill that general, so he had to kill two leaders, basically. And in 1860, the Taiping planned to take Shanghai to sort of increase their momentum again, and to increase their territory size, but they were halted by the Western trained and equipped ever victorious army. And this is a very interesting army because it was sort of a mix of Western soldiers and Chinese soldiers, and I believe the officers were Western, foreign, but the most of the grunts, the soldiers themselves, were actually Chinese. And so this was actually led first by the American general Frederick Townsend Ward, and then later the British general Charles George Gordon, who became known as Chinese Gordon. And this is the same general that dies in Egypt later, like I think the 1880s. And so in 1862, the war actually a little bit about the ever victorious army. They were able to halt this advance. In 1860, this army was able to stop the advance of the Taiping because the Western powers did not believe that the Taiping, they believed that if they took over Shanghai, this would jeopardize the favorable conditions to them in that city in terms of trade. If they took over the city, there would be too much chaos. They didn't like the way the Taipings were doing things. They realized that, these aren't really true Christians, and so they defended Shanghai, and they were able to stall the advance of the army. Now, in 1862, the war became in favor of the Qing. Zheng Guofan, probably one of the more famous generals to arise from this civil war, actually took Nanjing in 1864. It was a slow and steady kind of fight, but he finally did it. Hong was still in Nanjing, but he refused to leave because he believed that God would provide him assistance. Of course, there was no assistance, and he actually ended up becoming ill and dejected and committed suicide. It actually wasn't until 1871 that the rebellion officially ended, with the last of the Qing forces being eliminated by the Taiping forces were eliminated by the Qing forces. So it wasn't really until 1871. But if you look at the length, 1850 to 1871, this is a fairly lengthy civil war. This is not just 1 or 2 years, 3 years. This is like 20, 21 years. And so that's a little bit about the history itself, not going year by year, but just kind of hitting the high points. And so Taiping society, a little bit about Taiping society. So the Taiping believed that their god was a wrathful god. This is coming from the Old Testament. And the moral code was also fairly strict. So Taiping code said that there could be no slavery, no opium smoking, no adultery, no gambling, no use of tobacco or alcohol. And so none of those kinds of moral evils, if you want to call them that. Of course, not everyone followed the code. Actually, leaders like Hong actually enjoyed very large harems, for example. And so this is kind of one of those situations where this is what the code, this is what the moral law says, but are people actually following this moral law, this moral code? And in reality, it's actually the leaders who are breaking the law, but the lower level, the grunts in this Taiping rebellion, in this kind of new country, it's actually the grunts who are trying to follow, these rules and trying to put things into practice. And so actually this is one of the reasons why the Taiping rebellion started to lose momentum, because Hong just spent more time with harems and at his palace, and not necessarily leading his troops and creating an efficient bureaucracy and things like that. They were pretty well organized. The army was pretty well organized with generals and colonels and sergeants and lieutenants and things like, and corporals, things like that. Maybe not using those exact terms, but our Western equivalents. They had a command structure. But given the fact that the leader of this country, who is supposed to have unlimited power, or he's supposed to be the son of God, this is the son of God who is not necessarily practicing what he's preaching. And so one of the reasons why the Taiping sort of lost momentum, started to lose, is because the leader was just inefficient towards maybe like the middle of this rebellion. The leader, Hong, just really was not a good leader. And so it's also worth noting, talking about a little bit about Taiping society and why didn't this spread, for example, because the Taiping rebellion was mainly limited to southern China, and like they never took Beijing. This is not a rebellion that occurred in Beijing or in the north. This was mainly in the south, like Nanjing. It's worth to note that actually the Confucian ruling class, the scholar gentry, did not find the teachings of the Taiping, their interpretation. They really did not like this. It was very alien to him, because Christianity is, to China, Christianity is a foreign religion. At this time, there weren't very many converts, and this, to them, this is kind of like a new religion. And this is not something they were trained in. They were not trained in Christian teachings, and they thought that this was alien. It didn't really like the things that the Taipings were doing, and things like distributing land, like humanitarian values. These kinds of things, the Confucian ruling class really did not like. And so the Confucian ruling class, the scholar gentry, did not side with the Taipings. Most of them didn't, and they actually sided with the Qing, because they knew that the Qing meant keeping themselves in power, because the Qing dynasty used Chinese generals and Chinese scholar gentry to do their bidding, to implement laws. Even though the Manchurians were outnumbered, they can use the existing Chinese bureaucratic system to administer the country. And so so of course the Qing had kind of an incentive to keep the scholar gentry in power, because these scholar gentry people were the people who were running the country. And so the Qing didn't really want to upset these people. But in the first place, the scholar gentry didn't really buy into the Taiping religion, so to speak. And so that's also another factor in terms of the Taiping losing. And so now heading into the aftermath, there is no reliable record for the death toll, but maybe about 20 to 30 million. And this information I'm getting comes from like Necrometrics, Britannica.com, and so and a little bit of Wikipedia, but mainly Britannica.com and Necrometrics. And so 20 to 30 million. And so we're not really talking about hundreds or thousands. We're talking about millions of soldiers and civilians together in one number. That's a lot of people. And when we think about like our American Civil War, I mean, in this Civil War, China lost many, many more people. Agricultural land was often razed or sacked and just burnt, because both sides fought a total war style kind of war, where they were trying to do everything they can to eliminate the other side. And so actually this caused a lot of devastation. And when the armies actually captured the different cities, whether it be Qing capturing a Taiping city or Taiping capturing a Qing city, they actually butchered the population, just to make sure that there were no loyalists on either side, like any kind of spy or rebel or things like that. They had some pretty rough capturing. They had a pretty rough policy on capturing cities and things like that, and so this caused a lot of damage to the land and to the people, and it just wasn't a really good time for China. And it's really interesting to think about how the Qing dynasty, like this did not topple the Qing dynasty. It might have. One kind of interpretation I hear a lot is that if the Taiping linked up with the Nian rebels in the north, both groups together might very well have toppled the Qing dynasty and eliminated them altogether. There might have been mass unrest. That kind of leads me into the commentary and sort of like general overview or thoughts about this Taiping rebellion. As I was saying, there were other kind of conflicts going on, like the Nian rebellion. There were other things going on, and it's just surprising how, because of all these other rebellions and conflicts, that the Qing dynasty actually didn't fall. And so, for example, we already said the Nian rebellion. There's the Miao rebellion in the southwest, the Pantei rebellion in the southwest, the Dungan revolt in the northwest, the Second Opium War. So this is not, this is not Britain fighting the First Opium War and being over. I mean, there was a Second Opium War, this time with both Britain and America, and then also the Nepalese-Tibetan War, which Nepal actually invaded Tibet during this sort of like 1850, 1860, 1870 kind of time frame from 1850 to 1870. There were several conflicts going on, and it's maybe a little bit astounding to see how resilient the Qing dynasty were. And so, whether that be because of the Chinese generals like Zheng Guofan rising to the occasion, who knows? But that might be a factor. This was a very bloody conflict. There were a lot of, not just the Taiping rebellion happening. There were other conflicts happening, and this resulted in a very large loss of life. Probably not rivaled until World War II. Even, I don't know the exact numbers, but World War II, with the Japanese invasion of China, that caused a huge loss of life as well. And so foreign influences, I talked about the defense of Shanghai by the ever victorious army. This is actually where newer historiography focuses less on the participation of this ever victorious army and instead puts more emphasis on the native Chinese armies, for example, led by Zheng Guofan. And so these kinds of the foreign-led armies, actually, they were sort of like, not necessarily that they didn't matter at all, but while traditional historiography focuses on making them sort of like the star players, they were just a smaller portion of the entire war. They had a role, but it was smaller. At least that's from my understanding and readings of books on the Taiping Rebellion. The older books tend to focus on that traditional interpretation, while the newer books are challenging that interpretation, which isn't, I mean, that's not anything new in history. And so maybe just some questions to kind of top the episode off. So I guess one question is, and I don't say this in any way to disparage religion, but how could religion spark such a conflict? This isn't new. Religion can be controversial at times. The Crusades, for example, this is probably one of the bigger examples of one religion versus another. And so in this case, Confucianism usually is not defined as a religion, but this sort of Taiping religion, this sort of like this Christian influenced philosophy versus the established order, this kind of mainly Confucian, maybe some Taoism established order. This was sort of the conflict that we see in the Taiping Rebellion. And I say that because, this is, religion. I mean, again, not to disparage religion, but, like, it's kind of interesting to see how hard people fight for the religion. And also, do people even practice what they preach? For example, did Hong really believe in his teachings of Christianity? If he's busy in his palace or busy with harems, is he really practicing what he is trying to preach and what he's trying to say, the beliefs that he has? And so those are kind of, those are the kind of like thoughts running in my head. And, I'm just asking the question. I don't know if I have all the answers, and I probably won't, but it's just something to think about, like, do people really practice what they preach? And how far does that go out hand? Because he became the ruler of the country. This isn't just Joe Schmo on the street. He became the leader of the Taiping Rebellion, basically. And another question would be kind of like a what if question, actually. What would happen if the Taiping won? So again, given all the various conflicts and rebellions that occurred during the Taiping Rebellion, this like 20 year period, what if they actually won? And what if there was a Taiping country, like a Heavenly Kingdom right now, in the 21st century? Because this happened in 1850s, in the 1850s. So maybe like 150 years ago, there was a country called the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. And what if this survived? How would that have affected World War I and World War II? Well, let's just say World War II. How would that have affected World War II, for example? And would that have made China an easier target to control? Or would that have made China a harder sort of target to control or to penetrate or to influence? Because the kind of imperialism in China was more like a soft, indirect, like spheres of influence, not a direct colony per se. China was being carved up, but not necessarily into colonies, more like spheres of influence, spheres of influences. So that's kind of the question, like what if the Taiping won? Like would we have seen a faster advancement into some kind of warlord state? Because the warlord era happened after, let's say like 1912, like from like 1928, this sort of like warlord period where China was fractured. So the question is, like, if this Taiping country, this Taiping rebellion existed, if it existed at this time in 1850s and it continued, like, would that have paved the way for other parts of China to break away or secede or declare independence, those kinds of things? It's kind of interesting to think about because, the China we know is unified, except of course, this issue with China and Taiwan. And that's a separate issue in itself. But, on the whole, this 21st century country called China, there is no Taiping rebellion. China is not split into different spheres anymore. And so those are the kind of questions that I guess, kind of probing thoughts, like what if the Taiping actually won? So I think that's going to be it for this episode. I know the Taiping rebellion, other people could go deeper and deeper and deeper into the, for example, the battles, the generals, who was fighting whom, the death toll and things like that. But I kind of just want to give a general overview and just ask those kinds of questions, thinking like, well, how far do people take religion? Do people practice what they preach? What if China was disunified at this time and continued to be disunified all the way into the 21st century and things like that, with the exception of Taiwan? And so those are the questions I kind of want to probe, like judging from history and learning from history and kind of interpreting these events, making sense of our current political situation and things like that. So I appreciate you guys for tuning in, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.